You probably look out your window right now. Maybe you're glancing at the trees in your yard. You just see shade.
Right, or maybe a nice spot for a picnic.
Yeah, exactly. Or, I mean, if we're being totally honest, just a massive pile of organic material you're going to have to spend hours raking up in November.
Absolutely, the dreaded fall cleanup.
Right. We tend to see trees as these, fixed, permanent parts of the landscape. But right outside that window, hovering over your roof, your driveway, and your neighbors, is this delicate, incredibly high-stakes balance between arboreal health and massive structural integrity.
It is a really profound balance, and it's one we largely take for granted. I mean, we look at a mature tree, note that it has been there for decades, and we just assume nature is simply taking its course.
Which makes sense, intuitively.
It does, but placing a 10,000-pound, highly dynamic living structure within, say, 20 feet of a bedroom window, that changes the equation entirely. In a residential setting, it is anything but a self-sustaining system.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are going to look past the leaves and the branches to uncover the hidden physics, the hazard assessment, and the exacting science required to maintain the architectural backbone of your yard.
And there is a lot of science hidden up there.
There really is. This whole conversation was sparked by some fascinating operational guidelines from 860 Hartford Tree Service, dated March 26, 2026. Looking through their protocols for pruning and shaping around Hartford, Connecticut, it completely shattered my perception of tree care.
In what way?
Well, I always categorize it right alongside mowing the lawn or planting spring bulbs, You get the clippers, you round off the edges, you make it look neat.
Yeah, that aesthetic approach is how most property owners view it. But arboriculture is actually this exacting, very long-term science. Every single cut made to a tree fundamentally alters its growth trajectory for years, often decades to come.
So it's not like cutting grass at all.
Not at all. With a lawn, the grass regenerates identically a week after being cut. But pruning a branch, you're permanently redirecting the tree's hormonal energy. You are physically shifting its center of gravity.
Wow.
Yeah, you're altering its load-bearing structural integrity. So we are discussing something much closer to structural engineering and fluid dynamics than simple gardening.
That is wild to think about. But before we get into how to properly engineer these structures, we should probably understand the baseline. Like, what happens when we just don't intervene at all?
Right, the natural state.
Because the instinct is to assume that leaving nature to its own devices in a suburban yard is totally harmless. But looking at these operational guidelines, the concept of they call it a wild canopy, it's framed as a really serious liability.
It is. A wild, unmanaged canopy develops a whole host of compounding hidden dangers, because without intervention, trees naturally form highly compromised branch structures. A classic example of this is cross-branching.
Cross-branching. What exactly does that look like?
It's where limbs grow aggressively inward toward the center of the tree, and they are literally rubbing against or crossing over one another.
Oh, I've seen that. And beyond just looking kind of tangled and messy, that friction actually creates physical wounds, right?
It does. As the wind blows, they rub together, which strips the bark and exposes the inner cambium layer to pathogens. But even more dangerously, it leads to a condition arborists call included bark.
Included bark. I don't actually know what that means.
So when two branches grow too tightly together, typically in a really sharp V shape, the bark actually gets trapped in the tight crotch between them as they expand.
Oh, so they aren't actually merging into one solid piece of wood.
Exactly. Because bark has zero structural strength, those two massive limbs are just pressing against each other without being fused by solid wood. It essentially creates a critical fault line right in the middle of the canopy.
That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
It is. And simultaneously, an unmanaged tree will develop an incredibly dense exterior layer of foliage.
Which, I have to admit, feels entirely counterintuitive to me. My first thought is that a dense canopy is the goal. Like, more leaves mean more photosynthesis, more shade for the yard, and just a healthier tree overall.
Right, that's the common assumption. But a hyper-dense canopy essentially creates a stagnant microclimate inside the tree. It completely blocks out vital ultraviolet sunlight from reaching the interior branches.
Oh, so the middle of the tree is basically just in the dark.
In the dark, and it severely restricts airflow through the branches. And when you drop the airflow and block that UV sterilization from the sun, you are creating an environment with persistent trapped humidity.
Oh, I see where this is going. You're basically engineering the perfect incubator.
Exactly. Fungal spores and insect pests require that persistent moisture and shelter to germinate and thrive.
Yeah.
By allowing the canopy to become this dark, damp thicket, you're basically inviting vascular diseases and decay fungi to take hold where they are the absolute hardest to detect.
That makes so much sense. But the biological threat is really only half the equation, right? The physical and environmental threats are where that structural engineering aspect you mentioned becomes totally paramount
Absolutely.
because we have to factor in the local environment. The 860 Hartford Tree Service Guidelines specifically highlight the extreme weather variability in places like Hartford. We're talking about heavy spring winds, severe summer thunderstorms, and intense winter ice loading.
Right. The weather is a massive stress test for the tree.
Exactly. And when you combine those structural fault lines, like that included bark you were just explaining, with the extreme dynamic weight of a winter ice storm, those branches stop being just branches. They become these suspended hazards hanging directly over high-voltage power lines and people's roofs.
And the math on that gets terrifying very quickly. Just to give you an idea, a single cubic foot of ice weighs roughly 57 pounds.
Wait, really? 57 pounds just for a cubic foot?
Yeah. So when an unpruned, super dense canopy is coated in freezing rain, the load-bearing capacity of those weak V-crotches is easily exceeded. They just snap.
That is terrifying.
But even without the ice, wind presents a massive kinetic problem. By selectively removing diseased or poorly attached branches, professional arborists are physically reducing the static weight on heavy limbs, but they are also mathematically improving the tree's aerodynamic drag coefficient.
Visualizing this, it feels completely nautical to me. Like an overgrown, completely wild canopy is basically like a ship hoisting a massive, incredibly poorly designed sail right before a hurricane.
That is a brilliant way to look at it.
Right. Because if there's no airflow, since it's just a solid wall of leaves and tangled branches, it's going to catch absolutely all of that kinetic energy from the wind, and it's just going to snap the mast.
The sail analogy perfectly captures the physics at play here. The wind needs to pass smoothly through the canopy. If it hits a solid, dense wall of unpruned foliage, the kinetic energy doesn't just, vanish.
Where does it go?
It transfers dynamically down the trunk and directly into the root plate. So if you have a severe windstorm combined with heavily saturated soil from rain, that sail effect will literally upend the entire root system and topple the massive tree right out of the ground.
Oh, wow. So selective pruning allows the wind to basically slip through the canopy, drastically reducing the load transferred to the roots.
Precisely.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though.
Yep.
Because if I go hiking in the middle of an old-growth forest, nobody is out there calculating wind resistance or, thinning the canopy. There is no arborist with a chainsaw selectively shaping those 100-year-old oaks.
Isn't it fundamentally more natural to just let a tree grow exactly however its genetics dictate?
It's a great question. The biology of the tree is exactly the same, whether it's in a forest or a yard, but the context of the environment completely dictates the necessity of human intervention. Arborists actually refer to this as target assessment.
Target assessment, meaning what it might hit if it falls. Exactly. Risk isn't just the probability of a structural failure. It is the probability of a failure combined with what lies beneath it. In a dense forest, if a tree develops included bark and drops a 400-pound limb under the weight of winter snow, it just falls safely to the forest floor and begins the natural process of carbon cycling.
So the ecosystem actually benefits from it falling.
Right. It rots, feeds the soil, creates habitat.
But in a Hartford suburb, that exact same structural failure crushes a glass conservatory or, someone's minivan.
Exactly. The failure in the forest is just nature running its course. The failure in the yard is a catastrophic liability. We are demanding that these massive, highly dynamic organisms safely coexist with rigid human architecture. And that requires active management.
Okay, that totally reframes it for me. So assuming we understand that our overgrown tree is essentially a giant heavy sail waiting to catch a winter storm, the question becomes, who do we actually call to intervene? And looking at the operational protocols from Hartford, the recommendation is surprisingly counterintuitive.
It really is.
Right. If your primary goal is to save, protect, and beautifully shape the trees on your property, the source strongly recommends hiring a comprehensive tree removal service.
It seems like a total paradox on the surface.
It sounds completely contradictory. We want to preserve our trees and optimize their health, so we're going to hire the exact people whose primary operational function is to cut them down and run them through a wood chipper. It feels like hiring a demolition expert to do delicate structural engineering on your house.
I completely understand the hesitation there, but
Yeah.
analyzing the mechanics of tree removal actually reveals why they are uniquely qualified for this exact job.
Okay, lay it on me. Why the demolition guys?
Well, professionals who specialize in complex extractions and full canopy removals possess a highly specialized understanding of extreme weight distribution and dynamic load bearing.
Because they have to take it apart piece by piece.
Exactly. To dismantle a mature tree over a house without causing any damage, they have to use complex rigging, friction devices, and block and tackle systems. Think about it. When you drop a 1,000-pound piece of wood into a rope system, it violently shock loads the remaining structure of the tree.
Meaning they have to know exactly how much tension the remaining trunk can withstand before it just splinters and drops a ton of wood through the roof.
Exactly. When your daily job is calculating the exact failure points of a massive organism, knowing precisely how it falls apart under extreme stress, you inherently possess an elite understanding of how it stays together.
That makes total sense.
A removal specialist brings diagnostic precision to routine pruning. They aren't just looking at the leaf coverage to make it look pretty. They are conducting a comprehensive biomechanical analysis.
So they are actively hunting for the hidden flaws that my untrained eye would just walk right past.
Precisely. They are looking for very subtle biological indicators, like a slight weeping seam in the bark, or a ram's horn formation, which is where the tree is trying to physically close a wound, or even the presence of specific fungal fruiting bodies down near the root flare.
And those are signs of bigger problems.
They are clear indicators of severe internal decay that might not show any outward symptoms in the actual foliage for years.
Wow. And the Hartford guidelines stress that this level of hazard assessment is especially vital for navigating tight urban spaces and suburban lots. Because if you're maneuvering heavy-duty equipment around property lines, underground utilities, and garages, you absolutely cannot rely on guesswork.
No, you can't. And there's also a deeply biological reason for using full removal professionals for pruning, and it involves something called physiological shock.
Physiological shock. Okay, so this is where the structural engineering meets the plant physiology.
Exactly, because when you prune, you're fundamentally altering the tree's root-to-shoot ratio. You aren't just giving it a haircut. You are abruptly severing a massive portion of its photosynthetic capacity.
Right, you're taking away its food source. So if you just blindly hack away at the canopy to let the wind through, you leave the established root system completely starved of carbohydrates.
And when that happens, the tree essentially enters a state of panic. When an amateur removes too much foliage at once, the root system can no longer sustain itself. So the tree desperately tries to compensate by pushing out epicormic shoots.
Epicormic shoots. Are those rapid, aggressive, wispy little branches you sometimes see sprouting directly out of the main trunk after someone chops a tree way back?
Yes, exactly those.
And because they are basically panic growth, they aren't structurally sound, right? They don't have a deep, woody attachment to the center of the tree.
They are incredibly weakly attached. They grow exponentially fast just to replace the lost leaves, but they are highly susceptible to snapping off in the very next windstorm. By utilizing experts who understand both removal and physiology, you ensure that every cut calculates the exact percentage of foliage that can be safely removed.
So it mitigates that dangerous sale effect without starving the root system.
Right, which promotes stable, healthy regrowth rather than just structural chaos.
Okay, so our demolition experts turned arborists have balanced the physics, they've reduced the aerodynamic drag, managed the load distribution, and preserved the photosynthetic balance. But a tree is a living organism, and the yard is an entire interconnected ecosystem.
It is.
So we have to look at the limitations of pruning when it comes to disease, and we have to look at the ground beneath our feet. First, let's talk about tree disease, because selective shaping and pruning can save a tree, but only under certain conditions, right?
Yes, disease management requires a very clear understanding of what pruning can and cannot accomplish. Mechanical extraction, which is what pruning is highly effective for highly localized issues.
Okay, so if you have a specific pest infestation isolated to just one limb or a localized canker, pruning physically severs the affected tissue and halts the spread. So what does this all mean for a sick tree? If pruning stops localized pests but can't fix systemic decay, it's basically like amputating an infected finger to save the arm. But it won't do anything to cure a full-body fever, right?
The amputation analogy holds up perfectly. Provided the infection is actually limited to the extremity, pruning works. But pruning cannot cure systemic
Like
issues.
the full body fever.
Exactly. If we look at vascular wilt diseases, things like oak wilt or Dutch elm disease, the pathogen has already infiltrated the xylem.
The xylem.
It's the tree's internal water transport system located deep within the main trunk.
Ah, so cutting off the outer branches at that point is completely futile because the fungus is already running through the main arteries of the tree.
Right. And what's tragic is the tree will actually attempt to defend itself through a process called compartmentalization. It purposefully plugs its own vascular tissue to wall off the decay and stop the fungus from spreading.
Oh, wow. It tries to isolate it.
It does, but in doing so, it frequently cuts off its own water supply and actually dies from dehydration. This raises an important question, and it's why that elite professional hazard assessment is so vital. A professional must determine if the tree is dealing with a localized infected finger or a systemic full-body fever.
Because you can't just shape a dying tree and expect it to magically live.
Exactly. If it's systemic, shaping the canopy is pointless. Full extraction becomes the only safe and responsible option.
Which naturally leads us to the ground below. Let's say you do go through with a full extraction, or maybe you've just inherited property with several previously fallen trees. You might have a perfectly engineered, beautifully shaped canopy overhead, but the Hartford guidelines point out that the ecosystem is still deeply compromised if the yard is cluttered with dead stumps.
Yes. Stumps are far more than just aesthetic blemishes or, annoying lawnmower hazards. They act as biological reservoirs.
Biological reservoirs. So this goes back to the whole interconnected ecosystem concept. Leaving a rotting stump in the ground provides a massive food source for things like subterranean termites, right?
Termites, absolutely. But it also harbors severe root rot pathogens like armillaria.
And because many mature trees of the same species naturally form root grafts with one another underground, they're all connected. A pathogen festering in a dead stump can easily travel across that hidden subterranean highway directly into the vascular system of the healthy tree 30 feet away.
Exactly. So expert stump grinding isn't just about creating a manicured, clean slate for your landscaping aesthetic. It physically severs those fungal bridges.
So it literally stops the pathogens from spreading.
Yes, and it reclaims the critical soil volume so the healthy trees can expand their own root systems without all that dead competition. It addresses the health of the entire canopy from the subterranean level all the way up.
Okay, so having covered the physics of the canopy, the biological reality of vascular disease, and the hidden dangers in the soil, the final practical step for the listener to apply this knowledge to their own property is knowing when to take action. Like, what is the actual timeline of arboreal care?
The timing is dependent on variables like species, growth rate, and environmental stress. But the guidelines establish a baseline that consistently surprises property owners.
The numbers in the source material really are fascinating. It varies, but generally. Fully mature trees need a professional assessment and minor pruning every 3 to 5 years. But younger trees, the ones you maybe just planted a few seasons ago, actually require significantly more frequent intervention, typically every 1 to 2 years.
Most people instinctively allocate their time and resources in the exact opposite direction.
It's totally counterintuitive. You'd think the giant 50-foot oak tree hovering menacingly over your roof would need the most babysitting and constant reshaping. But it's actually the opposite. It's exactly like raising kids. The early, fragile years take all the intensive, frequent molding and foundation building, while the adults mostly just need a check-in every few years to make sure things aren't deteriorating.
That is a perfect analogy, and the biological mechanism behind that early shaping revolves around something called apical dominance.
Apical dominance.
Yeah. A young tree is incredibly vigorous, and it will often push out multiple competing leader trunks. Instead of one strong central trunk, you get 2 or 3 main stems growing parallel to each other.
Which creates that exact weak V-shape and the included bark we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Precisely. If you let those codominant stems grow unchecked for 30 years, you have essentially engineered a massive structural failure waiting to happen. But by bringing an arborist in every 1 to 2 years during the tree's youth, they strategically prune to suppress those secondary leaders.
So they are actively forcing the tree shape.
Yes. They redirect the tree's growth hormones, called auxins, to force a single dominant central trunk.
So you are literally dictating the mechanical distribution of stress for the next century. By putting in the work every 1 to 2 years early on, you prevent the need for drastic, dangerous and incredibly expensive emergency pruning decades later when the tree weighs 10 tons.
Exactly. You are deciding today exactly how that organism will interact with the wind, the ice, and the architecture around it in the year 2075.
It fundamentally reframes how you look at the landscape. Over the course of this deep dive, we've moved from viewing trees as just simple static yard decorations to understanding them as these massive, heavy, incredibly complex physical structures. We've explored the kinetic energy of wind drag, the precision of dynamic load bearing, and the vascular defense mechanisms of compartmentalization.
We've established that the intervention of a removal specialist is actually the most biologically sound way to mitigate the sale effect without sending the tree into shock. And we've seen how early architectural correction dictates the long-term survival of the whole canopy.
And the reason this matters to you, whether you are managing a historic home or trying to mitigate severe risks ahead of the winter storm season, or maybe you just want to rehabilitate a neglected oak shading your driveway, is that you now know the invisible science happening right outside your window. It is physics, hazard assessment, and structural engineering operating in real time.
Right, and understanding that ensures that the living architecture surrounding your home remains a profound asset rather than a suspended liability waiting to drop.
So as we wrap up this exploration into the high-stakes balance of the suburban canopy, we want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to ponder on your own the next time you step outside. We established today that a single, precise cut from an arborist alters the flow of growth hormones and dictates exactly how a tree will balance its weight against gravity for decades to come.
The entire trajectory of the organism is permanently shifted by that single human intervention.
So think about the oldest, wildly overgrown trees deep inside our ancient untouched forests. The ones that have never been shaped, never been thinned or balanced by a professional. When you look at their deeply scarred, twisted, and chaotic branches, you aren't just looking at wood. You are looking at a physical, biological record. What do those missing codominant leaders, those massive healed wounds, and those wildly uneven canopies tell us about the hidden history of the violent storms, the severe fungal diseases, and the absolute environmental chaos they had to somehow survive, completely without a professional's touch? Look out your window at the delicate balance in your own yard, and we'll see you next time.